If your tyranny alarms ring each time you discover that Massachusetts Senator Liz Warren, the Democrat, or one of her political ideas is in the news, well, you're not alone. And if those alarms ring with greater urgency upon finding out that something associated with Warren just got Supreme Court license to continue running roughshod over people's rights, well, you're in good company as well. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith for MRC-TV, and here's the story. In a 7-2 decision, the Supreme Court of the United States, the SCOTUS, ruled Thursday in the case of Consumer Financial Protection Bureau v. Consumer Financial Services of America Limited. And they ruled that the 2010 Warren brainchild, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, otherwise known as CFPB, not only can continue to exist, but that the Federal Reserve, being the CFPB's funding source, is somehow constitutional. Before we dig into the decision and the unusual split in opinion between Clarence Thomas, who sided with the majority, and Samuel Alito, who sided with the minority and wrote a blistering rebuke of the majority decision, it's valuable to recall some very key points. First, this is the United States of America, the government of which is supposed to operate by the wondrous U.S. Constitution that politicians such as Warren keep attacking as a matter of course. Second, within the U.S. Constitution, there's this crazy thing called the Bill of Rights, also known as the first 10 amendments to the document. And you know what? Some of those amendments come in rather handy here to see with great facility how obnoxious Warren's Frankenstein creation is. For example, the Fourth Amendment prohibits any agent of any level of government from obtaining private documents, property, or information in the form of communications or doing any search of a person or place without a judge-issued public warrant, citing the person to be searched and the item or items sought by the government. The Fifth Amendment promises that no one shall be deprived of due process, a process that includes a formal charge with a crime and a jury trial, and no level of government judicial system will put any person through double prosecution, otherwise known as double jeopardy. The Sixth Amendment promises a fair and speedy trial before a jury. It also promises the right to question witnesses and the right to a publicly provided attorney for defense. Now, I will mention some of my students properly question the assumption that government can force other people to pay for somebody else's government-provided lawyer, but that's a deeper political, philosophical question for another time. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and beyond those, the 14th Amendment reiterates the Fifth Amendment's promise of due process, all of which is important when studying this new Supreme Court decision, which focused solely on the funding mechanism of Warren's frightening gang and paid absolutely no attention to the fact that the CFPB can target vast numbers of Americans with snooping and prosecution, completely avoiding the Bill of Rights. As Mark Sherman explains for the Associated Press, a group of payday loan business owners whom the CFPB was targeting with edicts and restrictions, well, they in 2022 challenged the CFPB's funding scheme. And in the courts, things played out as one might expect. As with almost all other government bureaus, once created, they never die. In fact, this congressional creation doesn't even have to answer to Congress for its money. And the Supreme Court just ruled that that's perfectly okay. Quote, unlike most federal agencies, the Consumer Bureau does not rely on the annual budget process in Congress. Instead, it is funded directly by the Federal Reserve, with a current annual limit of around $600 million. The Federal Appeals Court in New Orleans, in a novel ruling, held that the funding violated the Constitution's appropriations clause because it improperly shields the CFPB from congressional supervision. And that's correct. According to the Constitution, all funding bills have to originate in Congress, and the Congress has to include what its members want to fund in their budget, which then would see the executive branch execute if the president and his branch employees found that the items being funded and the funds themselves comported with the U.S. Constitution. By creating the CFPB, then allowing it to exist in perpetuity with money that the Federal Reserve can just create out of nothing, the original Warren legislation that was passed in 2010 circumvents the Congress and creates a police force that doesn't have to answer to the legislative branch for its annual budget. That is one of the big problems with the CFPB, writes Sherman, quote, Thomas reached back to the earliest days of the Constitution in his majority opinion to note that the Bureau's funding mechanism fits comfortably with the first Congress's appropriations practice, which is, of course, ridiculous and exposed as such in lower court rulings that the CFPB appealed to get it to the Supreme Court. As Amy Howe observes for SCOTUS blog, Justices Sam Alito and Neil Gorsuch were blistering in their dissent. Quote, Justice Samuel Alito dissented in an opinion joined by Justice Neil Gorsuch. He offered a dueling interpretation of history that he suggested leads to the conclusion that the CFPB's funding scheme blatantly attempts to circumvent the Constitution. Indeed, she also notes that the payday lenders received a ruling in their favor via the full Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. Quote, the Court of Appeals agreed with the groups that the agency's funding structure, which was intended to foster its independence, is inconsistent with Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which instructs that no money shall be withdrawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. Yeah, you got that right. The Treasury is supposed to supply the funds, not a central bank cartel put into money printing power by a 1913 move that itself violates the Constitution. Adds Howe, quote, in fact, the Fifth Circuit concluded the CFPB's funding is double insulated from Congress's power under the Appropriations Clause because the agency not only receives its funding from the Federal Reserve, but it, rather than Congress, determines the amount of that funding by requesting the amount that the CFPB director deems reasonably necessary to carry out the Bureau's duties. It is all wonderfully amorphous, creates an extrajudicial and extra legislative snooping and punishment so-called Bureau, and it all runs completely contrary to the constitutional amendments that I noted earlier. But of course, none of that seems to matter to the majority of the Supreme Court. Likewise, they showed no interest in the fact that the Constitution requires federal government money to be coins, not paper, not digits created by a government-started Federal Reserve that can make its own cash and send it to the CFPB to keep breaching the Bill of Rights. So, Warren's creation, like most government agencies, will live on. Likely it will expand, and likely it will keep pushing around private business interests without any regard to the Constitution itself. It sure is great to know that the Supreme Court is so focused on the founding rules, isn't it? Thank you so much for watching, everybody. And remember, on Rumble, they don't censor us, so please follow us there and spread the word about the videos to as many people as you can. You'll also find us on YouTube where they do censor MRC-TV, but of course, if you are there, please double check that you're still subscribed. You can also find us anytime at MRCTV.org. That's MRCTV.org, where you'll see what the whole team is doing. While you're there, please consider donating to the Media Research Center to help us continue our work. You can also find the MRC Store there as well. Find us over on Facebook, on TikTok, on Instagram, and of course on X. And if you want to find me on Gab, I'm at Gardner Goldsmith on Gab, and on X, I'm at Gard Goldsmith. Thank you for watching, everybody. For MRC TV, I'm Gardner Goldsmith.
I want to invite you as my guest on a very special, once-in-a-lifetime, 7-day post-election cruise in the Caribbean. It's going to be a blast.